Well, brethren, the Bible is filled with all sorts of warnings and admonitions for God's people. And we have, particularly in the Old Testament, many examples and illustrations that are recorded. And we're told in the New Testament that one of the main reasons that many of these lessons are preserved is that they are recorded for us. The Apostle Paul, in writing to the Corinthians, to the Corinthian church, went through some of these examples and some important lessons that we can learn from a particular illustration. And I would like for us today to turn our attention to that and to focus in on some very important things that we need to keep in mind. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the Apostle Paul says, "Moreover, brethren, I would not that you should be ignorant about how that all our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. Were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness." Now all these things were our examples, he tells us. These are our examples. Now notice here, he said, look, I want you to think about something. Our forefathers, those who represented the founding of the church, the congregation of Israel, the church in the wilderness, they all started out coming out of Egypt with a high hand. In one sense, they were all baptized. The only example that I know in the Scriptures, somebody got baptized and didn't get wet. To be baptized is to be plunged into water. They were surrounded by water. They went through the Red Sea, and they had it on both sides of them, and the cloud was on top of them. So they were surrounded by water, but they didn't get wet. But Paul uses that, and he said, now they were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and the sea. They symbolically were immersed in that way. They did all eat the same spiritual meat, and they drank the same spiritual drink. You know, as we look back, and some of you sitting here have been in God's church for 20 years, 30 years, and more. We look back over the years, and you think back to the time, and you realize that of all of the people, of all the dozens and scores and hundreds and thousands with whom we all ate the same spiritual food and we all drank the same spiritual drink, we were all baptized. And yet, there have been many who were overthrown in the wilderness. Brethren, we are not to the promised land yet. Now there is a very important example. Everyone who left Egypt intended to go to the promised land. They all thought they would. Nobody left Egypt with their goal, their purpose in mind, saying, I'd like to be buried out under a rock in the desert. What I'd like to do, the reason I want to leave Egypt is I want to die in the Sinai wilderness. That's my goal. No. That wasn't the goal of anyone who left Egypt, but what we find is many, many, many of them did. With many of them, God was not well pleased. They were overthrown in the wilderness. Why were they overthrown? Why were they overthrown in the wilderness? God wasn't pleased with them. Do you remember what happened when Jesus was baptized by John? Remember that heaven opened and a dove descended, and a voice was heard from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Jesus Christ well pleased His Father in heaven. Brethren, all of us must have as our goal to well please our Father. All of us want to hear the saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Come and come into the joy of your Lord. You remember the parable that Christ gave, the parable of the pounds, the parable of the talents, as they're recorded there in the Scriptures? And how the master said, "Well done, good and faithful servant. I'm well pleased with you." Brethren, those are the words that all of us must yearn to hear. And yet, as we look back over the years, there are many with whom we have shared countless hours who will not hear those words. God has not been well pleased, and many have been overthrown in the wilderness. And brethren, others will be overthrown in the wilderness. You and I individually do not have to be among those who will be overthrown in the wilderness. But if we don't learn the lessons that are recorded right here, we will be. There's specific reasons why individuals were overthrown in the wilderness. In fact, we're going to see in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul shows 5 specific reasons why individuals were overthrown in the wilderness. And we'll notice even a couple of other examples or a couple of other lessons for us to learn from wilderness experience in some other scriptures. But Paul enumerates 5 basic categories that resulted in the overthrow of many people who left Egypt. They all drank the same spiritual rock. They all drank the same spiritual drink. They drank of the same spiritual rock. That rock that followed them was Christ. They all partook of the same spiritual nourishment. And yet with many, God was not well pleased. Why did they fall in the wilderness? What overthrew them? Paul said these things were our examples. So they're obviously examples and lessons that we are to learn as the people of God today from what the people of God in ancient times went through. They were our examples. Now notice, as we continue in verse 6, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Neither be you idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur you, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now all these things happened unto them for examples, for types. That's what the word literally is in the Greek. These were types. So Paul enumerates 5 type of problems that resulted in the overthrow and the destruction of God's people. These things happened unto them for types or examples, and they are written for our admonition upon whom the ends of the world are come. That's why it's recorded. Wherefore let him that thinks he stand take heed lest he fall. Brethren, that means it's written for all of us. None of us can say, well, I'm sure not going to ever have a problem like that. I'll never. Let him that thinks he stand take heed lest he fall. None of these people expected to fall the day they left Egypt. When they came out of Egypt with a high hand, they were excited. They had an excitement and an enthusiasm. But what we find is that it didn't last. And they didn't last, many of them. Let him that thinks he stand take heed lest he fall. None of us can ever make the statement, I'll never, leave God's church or God's truth. I'll never. No, I'll tell you what you can say. If I stay close to God, I'll never. Now, see, that's the qualifying statement, and that is the key. That little word, if. If I stay close to God, I'll never abandon the truth. If I stay close to God, I'll never turn away from my calling. If I stay close to God. You see, that's the key. Because let's not kid ourselves. The difference between our success and our failure is going to be our walking with God. When we rely on our own human strength and our own human power, then we're destined to fail because our strength is not sufficient. You remember Peter told Christ, he said, Lord, I'll never deny you. I'd die before I do that. And Christ said, Peter, the rooster won't crow this morning. A few hours from now, when the rooster crows, you will have already denied me 3 times before the rooster crows. Don't stand here and tell me what you'll never do. Well, Peter just knew. He said, I'll never do something like that. But you see, a little bit earlier, Christ took Peter and James and John and he said, look, fellas, I'm going to go pray, and you pray with me. And they went to sleep. He prayed fervently for an hour, came back, and here they were snoring. He woke them up and he said, look, can't you watch with me for an hour? You fellas really need to pray. You don't understand what's about to happen. He came back an hour later and they were sleeping again. When he finally, woke them up the second time, and sure enough, didn't take them long. They nodded back off. So here we are in the wee hours of the morning. He came back and he said, well, fellas, it's all over with now. You might as well just go on sleeping. You see, Peter was sleeping when he should have been praying. He thought his strength was sufficient. He didn't think he could ever do something like that. If he had been praying for those 3 hours rather than sleeping for those 3 hours, he probably wouldn't have. But you see, he learned a lesson out of that. And when you read the book of Acts, you don't ever find Peter doing that again. Because Peter learned a valuable lesson. He learned not to rely on his own strength. If you and if I rely on our strength, if I rely on my strength, if you rely on yours, we are setting ourselves up for failure. Because our strength will fail by virtue of the fact that it's physical. By virtue of the fact that we're physical. That we're limited. Our strength will fail. God's strength will never fail. Those who fell in the wilderness with whom God was not well pleased relied on themselves, and their strength failed. Things got to them. Everything didn't go the way they had expected. They got out in the desert, and guess what? I'm sure it was hot. You don't think they ran into a few days like today? It was hot, and the terrain was rugged. And there's snakes and scorpions in the desert. And it was rocky. And they had to walk. And everything didn't just go exactly the way some of them had sort of had in their mind that it would go. It was a little longer from Egypt to the Promised Land than what they had anticipated. And amazingly enough, God didn't ask them to write the script and then read His lines the way they had written them. It didn't work that way. Does God come down to your life and say, well, look, what you need to do is you just script it out. You tell me how it's supposed to be done, and I'll just read my lines. Doesn't work that way. With many of them, God was not well pleased. They were overthrown in the wilderness. We're told these things were types, were illustrations and examples. Let him that thinks he stand take heed lest he fall. So it's a warning to all of us. None of us can afford to say, that could never happen to me. Because, brethren, those who fell in the wilderness didn't think it could ever happen to them. Verse 13 says, there's no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. It's not that we're going to encounter some different thing that other people have never had to go through. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted or tested above what you're able. He will, with the test, with the temptation, make a way to escape that you may be able to bear it. The problems we're going to encounter are not unique. They're problems that human beings have always encountered. They're problems that the people of God have encountered as long as there have been people of God. the tests, the trials. That's why the things that happened to Israel in the wilderness are types that apply all the way down. Here we are, 3,500 years or 3,400 years after these events. And you know, it still holds true. They were types. They were illustrations of the kinds of things that will occur, that will trip people up. But God always provides a way. No test, no problem, no temptation, none of it has to swallow us up. God wants us to succeed. He's called us to success. God has not foreordained you or me or any other single individual saying, you are not going to be able to make it. I am calling you to get you out in the middle of the desert so I can bury you under a rock someplace. That's not the reason God called any of us out of Egypt. God didn't call us to failure. And He gives us the information we need to know for success. But in order for us to be successful, we have to take and apply the lessons that are preserved for us. Now, notice, these things were our example, verse 6, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Now, we're told right here that they lusted after evil things. Let's go back to the book of Numbers. Interestingly, the Jews refer to the book of Numbers in Hebrew as by the title, In the Wilderness. Now, that is taken from, in fact, let's just notice very briefly Numbers chapter 1. Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, And the Lord spoke unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tabernacle of the congregation, on the first day of the second month, second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Take you the sum of the congregation. So our word Numbers comes from verse 2, that you were to, our title, that you're to take the sum, or he was to number the congregation. But the first verse tells us that the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness. And the whole story of the book of Numbers is what occurred during the time in the wilderness. So the examples of the church in the wilderness are recorded here. Let's notice Numbers 11, verse 1. When the people complained, it displeased the Eternal, and the Lord heard it. And His anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them, and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. Now I would just like to call our attention, just before we get on down, let's notice here in verse 1, God listens to what we're saying. You know, in the book of Malachi, we're told those that feared the Lord talk often one with another, and the Lord hearkened and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written. We're told that. In fact, let's just turn to it. Hold your place in Numbers, if you will, but back in the book of Malachi, that Malachi 3:16, Then they that feared the Eternal spoke often one to another, and the Eternal hearkened and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before Him for them that feared the Lord and that thought upon His name. And they shall be mine, says the Lord of hosts, in that day when I make up my jewels, and I will spare them as a man spares his own son that serves him. Then shall you return and discern between the righteous and the wicked, between him that serves God and him that serves Him not. God listens. Those that feared the Eternal spoke often one to another. There was a close comradeship and fellowship. They spoke often one to another, and the Lord hearkened and heard it. God listened, and He was pleased with what He heard. What did He hear? He heard people encouraging and building up one another's faith. And God was pleased. He hearkened. He listened. And He says, they're going to be mine. You see, He wrote a book of remembrance. God took note of it, of them that feared the eternal, that thought upon His name. What are you talking about? Well, you're talking about what you're thinking about. They were thinking upon God's name. God's name reflects God's character, His nature, all the attributes and aspects of God. So if they were thinking about that, thinking about God and His greatness and His power and His plan and His purpose, and they were talking to one another and encouraging one another and building one another up, God listened and He said, that's good. And when the time of tribulation comes on to try the whole earth, I'm going to spare them as a man spares his son that serves him. Because He's going to return and discern between the righteous and the wicked, him that serves God and those that don't. There's going to be a distinction made by God. And so we see that God listens. Now here we find in Numbers 11 verse 1, the people complained and it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it. And His anger was kindled. God was listening, and what did He hear? He didn't hear people building one another up and encouraging one another's faith and focusing in on what was good and positive and constructive. He didn't hear people pointing toward God and His plan and His purpose and encouraging one another's faith. He heard people griping and bellyaching and complaining, and God was not happy. He was not pleased with what He heard. The question for you and for me to ask ourselves is, if Christ were sitting in our living room or at our table, what difference would it make in the conversation we were carrying on? Would we change the subject if He came in? Because we would be embarrassed for Him to hear what we were saying? Brethren, He's already listening. He's already listening. We need to be aware and to think in terms. Is God pleased when He listens in on our conversation with one another? Is He well pleased? Well, as we come on down, verse 4, the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting, and the children of Israel wept again and said, who will give us flesh to eat? We remember the fish, which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. Our soul is dried away. There's nothing at all besides this manna before our eyes. Oh, woe is us. All we've got is manna. We don't like it. Manna was as coriander seed. The color thereof was the color of bdellium. The people went about and they gathered it, ground it in mills, or beat it in a mortar. They baked it in pans, made cakes of it. Well, you could do just about anything with it. It fell when the dew fell upon the camp. Moses heard the people crying and bawling and bellyaching in verse 10, and the anger of the Lord was greatly kindled. God was disgusted with this sort of an attitude. And Moses said unto God, he was not too happy either, he said, wherefore have you afflicted your servant? Wherefore have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Have I conceived them? Have I begotten them? That you should say unto me, carry them in your bosom as a nursing father bears a suckling child? Moses told God, he said, Lord, I thought you liked me. I thought you and I were friends. You said I was your friend. I thought you loved me. What did I do to deserve this? Look at them. Look at all this bunch of people out here, bawling and bellyaching and carrying on and griping and complaining and murmuring and just, what did I do? They're not my kids. I didn't conceive them. I didn't beget them. Why should I have to carry them like a little baby that's, I got to carry them all the way through the wilderness like a little squalling baby? What did I do to deserve this? Verse 13, whence should I give flesh? Should I have flesh to give unto the people? They weep unto me, saying, give us flesh that we may eat. I'm not able to bear all this people alone. It's too heavy for me. I'm up to here with it every time I turn around. So God told Moses to gather 70 men of the elders that he recognized as elders and to bring them there to the tabernacle. And God was going to actually give His Spirit to these individuals that they would be able to assist Moses in the government. Now, Come on down, verse 18. Say unto the people, sanctify yourselves against tomorrow, and you shall eat flesh. You've wept in the ears of the Eternal, saying, who will give us flesh to eat? It was well with us in Egypt. Wherefore the Lord will give you flesh, and you'll eat it. You'll not eat 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, neither 10 days, nor 20 days, but even a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils. All right, you want it, I'm going to give it to you until you are sick of it. You sort of get the idea that God was not real happy. I'm going to give it to you a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils, and it'll be loathsome to you because you've despised the Lord which is among you, and you've wept before Him, saying, why came we out of Egypt? Oh, I wish we stayed in Egypt and we could have had melons to eat. So, God says, I'm going to give them flesh to eat a whole month. And Moses said, well, Lord, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of folks. Where in the world are you going to get all this? The flocks and the herds, are we going to kill all the flocks and the herds? You're going to gather all the fish of the sea together to suffice them? Where in the world are we going to get all the food? You're going to do this? And Moses said the Eternal said unto Moses, is the Lord's hand waxed short? You think I've got a problem coming up with the food? So anyway, they went on down, and sure enough, in verse 31, there went forth a wind from the Lord, brought quails from the sea, let them fall by the camp, as it were a day's journey on this side, and as it were a day's journey on the other side, round about the camp, and as it were 2 cubits high on the face of the earth. I mean, these quail flew in and piled up. And the people stood all that day and all that night and all the next day, and they gathered the quails. He that gathered the least gathered 10 omers, and they spread them out all abroad for themselves round about the camp. And while the flesh was yet between their teeth, before it was chewed, the wrath of the Eternal was kindled against the people, and the Lord smote the people with a great plague. Now, evidently, they didn't even bother to properly bleed them or cook them. Just started gorging themselves on this stuff, and God was disgusted. Now, what were we told back in 1 Corinthians 11? Or 1 Corinthians 10, rather. See, the first thing, these things were examples. Verse 6, to the intent we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. The first problem that is mentioned was their lust for material things. Why? They were greedy and materialistic. That took many of the people who came out of Egypt. A greedy, materialistic approach. They were not satisfied with what God did. With what they had, they were greedy, they were materialistic. That was where their mind was. That was what they were continually thinking about. Many fell in the wilderness because of their greed and materialism. Psalm 78 and Psalm 106 both address the subject. We might notice in Psalm 106, it talks about what God had done. In verse 7, our fathers understood not your wonders in Egypt. Coming on down, we're told in verse 14 of Psalm 106, they lusted exceedingly in the wilderness and tempted God in the desert, and He gave them their request, but sent leanness unto their soul. Sent leanness into their soul. He gave them their request. He let them have what they wanted. But you see, they were greedy and materialistic. That's where their focus was. They were dissatisfied. They were dissatisfied because their focus was on the wrong thing. And therefore, they never were able to really appreciate what God had and what God gave them. You know, they ultimately got a lot of what they were craving. But they suffered as a consequence. We find time after time that what God did. We notice in Psalm 78. We read in verse 22, Because they believed not in God and trusted not in His salvation, though He had commanded the clouds from above and opened the doors of heaven, and had rained down manna upon them to eat, and had given them the corn of heaven, man did eat angels' food. He sent them meat to the full, caused an east wind to blow in the heaven, and by His power He brought in the south wind. Verse 29, it says, they did eat and were well filled. He gave them their own desire. They were not estranged from their lust. While their meat was yet in their mouth, the wrath of God came upon them and slew the fattest of them, smote down the chosen men of Israel. And over we see. You see, there was a greedy, materialistic approach. Many fell in the wilderness. Paul said, now, these things are examples, they're types for us. Why do all of those who started out baptized, why did all of those who started out on the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land not make it? All of those who were baptized, nourished by the same spiritual nourishment. One of the things that took many from Israel of old, and things that have taken people, as we look back, from the time that God began to raise up this Philadelphia era of the church through Mr. Armstrong back in the 1930s, there have been many, many thousands who have been baptized. Many of those have fallen in the wilderness, with whom God was not well pleased. One of the reasons that has taken some has been a greedy, materialistic approach, a lack of spirituality, a focus on material things, and a greedy, lustful approach after those material things. Paul warned Timothy. He said talked about how that those who were purely materialistic in their outlook could fall into every sort of problem imaginable. Paul warned Timothy, told him in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 7, we brought nothing into this world, and it's certain we can carry nothing out. Having food and raiment, let us therewith be content. They that will be rich, that's their goal, just to acquire material things. They'll fall into temptation and a snare, into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in perdition and destruction. For the love of money is a root. It's not the only root, but it is a root of all evil. There are people who've done anything you can think of for money. There's not a single commandment that hasn't been broken by some. People have killed for money. They've committed adultery in the pursuit of money and power, the greed and acquisition of things, which while some have coveted after, they've erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. You, man of God, flee these things, follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, meekness, fight the good fight of faith, lay hold on eternal life, whereunto you're called, and have professed a good profession before many witnesses. So, we're warned of that. Many fell in the wilderness because of greed and materialism. They lusted. Notice the second thing we're told in 1 Corinthians 10. Verse 7, it says, neither be you idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, you remember that story. That's found back in the book of Exodus. Moses had gone up in the mountain to get the 10 Commandments. The people had heard the 10 Commandments spoken from Mount Sinai by God Himself, and they had responded when God said, I propose a covenant. The people said, all that the Lord has said, we will do. God spoke the words of the 10 Commandments. But Exodus 32 verse 1 says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mountain, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, up, make us gods which shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. And so we find that Aaron made a golden calf. The people said here in verse 4, these be your gods, O Israel, which brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Aaron saw it. He built an altar, made a proclamation, tomorrow is a feast to the eternal. They rose up early on the morning, offered burnt offerings, brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. See, that's what Paul was quoting back in 1 Corinthians 10. What did they do? They built a golden calf. They went into idolatry and paganism. Now, we've gone through an experience in recent years where we have seen thousands of the people of God fall in the wilderness because they made a golden calf. They wanted a God like the Egyptians had. They wanted paganism. And so now they've got it. With Christmas and Easter and all the goodies that come with it that go all the way back to Egypt and Babylon. Made them a golden calf. That's what the people of Israel did. They wanted religion like the world had it. They had left Egypt with their feet, but they stayed in Egypt with their mind and with their heart. They took Egypt with them on the inside. And so, problems came along. You see, in this case, what do we find? We find the people never looked beyond Moses to see God. People who built the golden calf, all they saw was the human leader. And when Moses wasn't there any longer, they decided they would make a change because that was Moses' religion. That was Moses' God. See, Moses had given them that old law. Remember, one of the commandments said, "You shall make unto you no graven image to bow down thereto or to worship." They'd heard that it hadn't even been 6 weeks. Hadn't even been 6 weeks since they had heard the voice of God's thunder from Mount Sinai. "You shall make unto you no graven image to worship or to bow down to." So what did they do? They said, "Well, let's grave out a golden calf." That's what we used to have back in Egypt. You know, we want that old religion like we had back there. They went back to Egypt in their hearts. Idolatry, paganism. Paul says, don't fall into idolatry as some of them did. Don't go back into pagan, idolatrous religion. God brought them out of Egypt to come and to have a relationship with Him and to worship Him in sincerity and truth. To worship Him according to the pattern that He had set and established. Not to hold on to what the Egyptians had done. You see, the problem with idolatry is it blinds you to the true God and to His plan and to His purpose. Idolatry deflects faith from the invisible God to something that can be seen and touched and measured and felt. The golden calf was more real to them than the invisible God that had opened the Red Sea. That's a pretty incredible thing, isn't it? But we see a lesson. We see an example. Over the years of all of the many thousands who started out on the journey, some have departed, have fallen in the wilderness because they were greedy and materialistic. And they began to begrudge what, quote, they were giving up. You know, we've heard people talk like that. Most of you have, one time or another. It's as though they would have been J. Paul Getty if they could have worked on the Sabbath and not had to tithe, you know. They'd just been right up there with Bill Gates. Well, you know, that's not really what happened. That's not what kept them from prosperity, is it? Having to obey God. No, materialism and greed have taken some. Idolatry and paganism have taken others. They've gone right back to Egypt. They've laid aside the truth of God, the revelation of God. And they've wanted a golden calf. See, that's what they worshipped in Egypt. They worshipped golden calves. They were the Apis bull, which was the symbol of the sun god. In fact, there's a tomb in Egypt that was discovered that actually was, in terms of the chronology of Egypt, because they had mummies of all these bulls, of the Apis bull, which was viewed as the reincarnation of the sun god. And they had hundreds of these bulls that had been mummified and kept there in his tomb. You know, the succession of Apis bulls. Crazy. And if you wonder why they worship cows in India, go back and study the story of Egypt and India and how their ancient religions interacted. India got what it got from the Egyptians. There was quite a trading link across the Arabian Sea. If you look at a map, you see when you come out the bottom of the Red Sea, you trade there. The ships would land on the tip of Arabia and go right across the Persian Gulf up there to Babylon, up the Euphrates, and land on the coast of India. And so that religion spread. So idolatry took many. Materialism took some. Idolatry and paganism took others. Let's notice what the next thing Paul warned, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He said, neither let us commit fornication, verse 8. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed and fell in one day 23,000. Now, you can read about that in Numbers chapter 25. Back in Numbers 25, verse 1, Israel abode in Shittim, and all the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. They called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods, and the people did eat, and they bowed to their gods. Israel joined himself to Baal Peor, and the anger of the Eternal was kindled against them. And so we read the story here of what happened, and those that died. Now, they began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. They began to get entangled with the world around them. Here they went back into an ungodly, worldly lifestyle. It was loose, that was immoral. You see, there are different things that can take people out. It doesn't always have to be greed for material things. Sometimes they go back into paganism and idolatry. Other times they just get involved in an ungodly way of living. Here they began to go down and mix and mingle and get all involved, out boozing it up and whoring around, doing the things that the Moabites were doing. They went down there and got involved with them, and God was disgusted. Israel was called to be a holy people, a holy nation, and to walk before God in holiness. And they threw it aside. And they were no different than the world around them. Fornication. They became involved in an ungodly lifestyle. Became involved in sexual immorality. They became involved in all of the things that the world around them was doing. They became just like everybody else. God calls us as His people to be a holy people unto the Lord. We are to reflect God's standards and values in our lives, in our conduct. Many fell in the wilderness. Many with whom God was not well pleased. Getting all entangled in the lifestyle of the world, becoming just like the society around us, which is increasingly modern Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, again, that over the years, see, why have people left? Why have so many fallen in the wilderness? For some, it's been immorality. They've gotten tangled up in fornication. They have gotten involved in a worldly lifestyle and have just begun to blend in with the world. They've been out doing things they shouldn't have done. They have the equivalent of going down and getting involved with the wild parties down in Moab. That's what they were doing, you see. It was their version of they were the real party animals there in Moab. And now let's look at something else. That's one of the things. 1 Corinthians 10 once again. Verse 9. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed of serpents. Now, how did they tempt Christ? What does that mean? Well, let's notice a couple of examples. Let's notice back in Numbers 21. What does it mean to tempt Christ? How can you tempt God? Numbers 21:5, the people spoke against God and against Moses, saying, "Wherefore have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loathes this light bread." The Lord sent fiery serpents among the people. Well, that's what Paul is making reference to. He said, neither tempt Christ, as some of them tempted and were destroyed of the serpents. Notice their attitude. They spoke, how did they tempt God? They spoke against God, saying, "Why have you brought us out here? We're going to die." Now let's go back to Exodus 17. Let's notice another example. Verse 2 of Exodus 17. "Wherefore the people did chide with Moses, and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, Why chide you with me? Wherefore do you tempt the Eternal?" Verse 5, we're told that God established a testimony in Jacob. He appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children, that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments. Coming on down, we find that all the wonderful things that God did, and how He provided water and gave them to drink out of the depths in verse 15, brought streams out of the rock in verse 16. Verse 17, they sinned yet more against Him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness. They tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust. They spoke against God and said, "Can God furnish a table in the wilderness?" So we're told that He smote the rock, and the waters gushed out, and the streams overflowed. And the people said, "Well, can He provide flesh for His people?" And over and over, this sort of an attitude that came out. We're told that this sort of down in verse 40. "How often did they provoke Him in the wilderness and grieve Him in the desert? Yes, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. They remembered not His hand nor the day when He delivered them from the enemy, how He wrought signs in Egypt and wonders in the fields of Zoan. It turned their rivers to blood and their floods that they could not drink." And He did all these various things. But what did God do? What did they do? They turned back, they tempted God, and limited the Holy One of Israel. How can you limit the Holy One of Israel? Well, let me show you an example that we find examples in the gospel accounts, speaking of Jesus Christ. And you know, one of the things that we're told is that when Christ came to His own country, to His own people, we're told that the people responded by saying, "Who is this? You know, who does He think He is?" And they didn't really believe. And we're told that Christ was amazed at their unbelief, and that He could do no mighty works there, except that He laid hands on a few sick people and healed them. So we find that this sort of an attitude that came out, that reflected they limited the Holy One of Israel by unbelief. They limited God's working in their lives. They limited God through their unbelief. They did not walk before God in faith. They continually doubted and disbelieved what God had said and what God had promised.
They had an attitude, regardless of all the things that God had done, they had an attitude of doubt and disbelief. They limited the Holy One of Israel through unbelief. They tempted God continually, testing God. The context is in a doubting way. Well, I don't know if God can do this, and I don't know if God can do that, and let's see if God can do the other. An attitude of doubting that God really would do what He said, and in effect sort of challenging God in a doubting way. You know, Satan quoted the Scripture. He said, when he was tempting Christ in the wilderness, he said, you know, jump off the pinnacle of the temple. Isn't it written, you won't dash your foot against a stone? Christ said, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. See, Satan was in effect saying, look, you know, God says this, but I don't think we can really believe it. Sort of doubt that, don't you? You know, let's put him to the test. Let's just go ahead and jump and see what happens. See, he says he's given his angels charge over you. Let's just go ahead. Why don't you jump? A challenging, tempting, doubting approach. Well, I don't know if we can really count on God. Just have to put it to the test over and over. So we find that in Hebrews 3, Paul said in verse 7, or verse 16 rather, Hebrews 3:16, some, when they had heard, did provoke, howbeit not all that came out of Egypt by Moses. But with whom was he grieved 40 years? Was it not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? To whom did he swear that they should not enter into his rest? But to them that believed not. So we see they could not enter in because of unbelief. Chapter 4, verse 1. Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short. Unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them. The word preached didn't profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. We which have believed do enter into his rest. He said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundations of the world. And he goes on talking about this, but notice the key here has to do with belief. It has to do with faith. A little later in Hebrews chapter 11, the Apostle Paul makes a strong statement. Let's start here in Hebrews 11, verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good report. Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. By faith Enoch was translated. Verse 6, here's the key. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that comes to God must believe that he is, and he's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. The key, it's impossible to please God without faith. Faith involves believing that God is, and he's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. God will take care of you if you are walking with him and seeking him. Trusting God. That's what we're talking about. A matter of trusting God, that God is real to us. And that we're walking with him, that we trust him. Ultimately, those who fell in the wilderness fell because they got their eyes off of God. And in some cases, their eyes never really were on God. They may have been on Moses. A lot of them obviously never saw past Moses. They saw the miracles. They saw the great things. But all they could see was Moses. And when Moses was gone, well, so was their faith. There was a very shallow level of understanding and commitment. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. He that comes to God must believe that he is, and he's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. They tempted and tested God in the wilderness because they didn't trust God. And they fell in the wilderness. Over and over and over again, they tested. They limited the Holy One of Israel through their unbelief. They did not trust God. They limited him in their minds and in their hearts. God wasn't real to them. They doubted over and over and over again. God was not well pleased by their attitude of doubt, their lack of trust. Now, let's notice one other thing, the fifth thing that Paul mentions here in 1 Corinthians 10. It says in verse 9, not to tempt Christ as they tempted. Verse 10, neither murmur you, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. Don't murmur. Let's go back to Numbers 14. Numbers 14, verse 2. All the congregation of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. The whole congregation said unto them, would God we died in the land of Egypt, or would God we died in the wilderness. Therefore, as the Lord brought us into this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey. Were it not better for us to return to Egypt? They said unto one another, let's make a captain and let's return to Egypt. Let's have an election. They didn't like the way God was running things. And they murmured. And they griped. And they complained. They didn't like it. So they said, you know what we need to do? We need to have a change in government. We need to elect somebody who will follow the will of the people. We want to go back to Egypt. Let's elect the man of the people. Now, it's interesting because as you come right on down, we find that in chapter 16, now Korah, the son of Izhar, he's one of the descendants of Levi, along with Dathan and Abiram, who were descendants of Reuben. Verse 2, they rose up before Moses with certain of the children of Israel, 250 princes of the assembly, famous in the congregation, men of renown. Here were some of the leading people. They've been doing a little murmuring. They gathered themselves together against Moses and against Aaron and said, you take too much upon yourselves, seeing that all the congregation are holy. Every one of them. Why, these are all God's people. The Lord is among them. Wherefore lift you up yourselves above the congregation. Said, why, you just, you take too much upon yourselves. You lift yourselves up. You're just a dictator. How do you get to be running everything? Why, we're all God's people. And so, you know, they had this attitude. Here we find this attitude of murmuring. People were griping, they were complaining, they were finding fault. They found fault with Moses all the way through the wilderness. Here was one of Moses' cousins. And he begins to stir up the people, sort of a demagogue, and he says, why, look, we're all God's people, and everybody here, why, we're all a holy people, and I think the people ought to choose their own leader. You lift yourself up among us. You're just trying to run things, Moses. Now, was that Moses' attitude? Was their evaluation accurate? They said, you lift up yourselves among us. You lift up yourselves above us. What we find? We find that when Moses heard it, he fell on his face. Moses didn't lift himself up. Moses trusted God and walked with God. God put Moses in charge. Moses was the meekest man in all the earth. But not according to his critics. They said, why, we think Moses is sort of a dictator. He just wants to run everything. And, of course, you know, they began to talk things up, and sure enough, people sort of listened to that and said, yeah, that's right, we're all holy. We ought to have more voice in things. So we find, you know, you can read the story. You're familiar with the story of Korah and Dathan and Abiram here in Numbers chapter 16, and how God destroyed them. And we find that there were, verse 49, there were over 14,000 people that God slew in a plague. And so this, this occurred. And so we find what happened and how God intervene in this way. And over and over, you can find this this sort of thing. That God raised up Moses. God was the one who led the children of Israel, but so many of them did not see God. All they saw was Moses. Again, back in Psalm 78, Psalm 78, verse 10, they kept not the covenant of God, they refused to walk in His law, and forgot His works and His wonders that He had showed them. See, that was the key. They forgot. We find that, verse 22, they believed not in God and trusted not in His salvation. So He had done all these things. They didn't believe, they didn't trust. They limited the Holy One of Israel. Verse 42, they remembered not His hand, nor the day when He delivered them from the enemy. They didn't remember. They didn't think about those things. Psalm 106. Verse 1, praise you the Lord, O give thanks unto the Lord. He is good. His mercy endures forever. Who can utter the mighty acts of the eternal? Who can show forth all His praise? Blessed are they that keep judgment, he that does righteousness at all times. Remember me, O Lord, with the favor that you bear unto the people. Visit me with your salvation, that I may see the good of your chosen. He talks about, in verse 7, our fathers understood not your wonders in Egypt. And he goes through all the various things that God did, and how He saved them from the hand of him that hated them, and redeemed them from the hand of the enemy, in verse 10. And we're told in verse 16, they envied Moses also in the camp, and Aaron the saint of the Lord. And the earth opened and swallowed up Dathan, and covered the company of Abiram. A fire was kindled in their company, and the flame burned up the wicked. You see, they envied Moses. They murmured, they griped, they complained. There was an attitude of negativism that went forth. We find on down in verse 24 here, Psalm 106. They despised the pleasant land. They believed not His word, but murmured in their tents, and hearkened not unto the voice of the Lord. Wherefore He lifted up His hand against them to overthrow them in the wilderness, to overthrow their seed also among the nation, and to scatter them in the land. Oh, you see, they murmured, they complained. What was the result of the murmuring and the complaining? It served to undermine faith. One of the things that you see that went through Israel of old was this attitude of negativism. A negative, doubting, complaining, griping, murmuring attitude that served to subvert the faith of the people. Instead of focusing in on God and His power and His plan and His love, instead of focusing in on the things that built them up, they talked one to another all right, but what they talked about was to complain. And they continually murmured. And oh, how woe is us, and how rough we've got it. They were not thankful to the Holy One of Israel. They didn't spend their day thanking God for having brought them out of Egypt and having promised them the promised land. Well, they wanted the promised land, but then they found out there were some difficulties. You remember the spies came back and said, hey, there are giants in the land. Oh, well, there are giants. I can't go in and face giants. Oh, no, not giants. Oh, woe is me. Let's elect a man of the people who will take us back to Egypt. Maybe Pharaoh will let us be his slaves again. You know, absolutely crazy. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10, these things were types for us. They're written down as types or examples. And they illustrate what has always beset the people of God. You see, without faith it is impossible to please God. Those who have fallen in the wilderness, all the way down from the first century, all the way down to our day, those who've fallen in the wilderness during the time of this age, this era, those who have fallen in the wilderness have fallen for different reasons. Many have fallen and will fall because they murmur. They murmur. Instead of going to God, they go to other people, and they subvert the faith of some, and they get people stirred up, and they're negative, and they doubt this and they doubt that. They're not focused on God. They don't have an attitude of faith and trust and confidence in God. We serve the living God. God has called us to fulfill a plan and a purpose. And so they murmur. They found fault with Mr. Armstrong, they'll find fault with Mr. Meredith, and they'll find fault with me, and they'll find fault with whoever. They found fault with Moses. Now, were there any faults to find? Yes. Moses made mistakes. When Moses made a big one, God dealt with him pretty strongly. Moses didn't get to enter the promised land. He lost his temper. God dealt with him. Mr. Armstrong made mistakes, you bet. So has Mr. Meredith, and so have I. There's no question about that. The issue is, what is our attitude? What is our focus? If we focus on people, it will bring us down. People ultimately who have left because they focused on people. They got their eyes off God. People here, the children of Israel, got their eyes off of God and onto Moses, and all they could see was Moses. And so Moses had made this mistake, or they didn't think Moses could do this, or they didn't like this idea or that thing. They weren't focused on God, and they weren't following God. And so they fell in the wilderness, and if you read the story, you find that the success rate of those who left Egypt was pretty small. Joshua and Caleb finally entered the promised land of that generation. I don't think we're looking at quite those percentages today, but Paul said the things that happen to them are the things that will afflict the people of God. These are types of problems that happen. When you look back at those whom you and I have known who started out with us, who started out, maybe you look back, you think of those maybe who were baptized when you were baptized. Some of you were baptized sort of in a group. Maybe there were 6 or 7 or even more, all baptized at the same time. What's happened to them? Well, some have maybe remained faithful. Some have perhaps died in the faith. Others have gotten sidetracked. Maybe they were lusting for material things. They were greedy and materialistic, and that took them away. Others became ensnared in idolatry and paganism and went back to Egypt. Others became entangled with the world, worldly lifestyle, perhaps fornication or immorality, and just became swallowed up by worldliness. Others simply limited God's working in their lives because of their unbelief. They lacked faith. They didn't trust God. God wasn't real to them. And so, they tempted the Holy One of Israel. They limited the Holy One of Israel by their lack of faith. Others murmured, became ensnared by complaining, by negativism. You see over and over, and if you go through Psalm 106, it gives some of the same things. We're told, you see, in Psalm 106, verse 12, they believed, then believed they his words, they sang his praise. See, they started out, they were excited. They soon forgot his works, they waited not for his counsel. They forgot. They did not remember. Brethren, the thing that keeps us focused on faith, in faith, is to continually bring to mind the wonderful works of God. To reflect on what God has called us for. You see, here were people who forgot God, forgot the wonderful works God had done. They lost sight of their calling, of the very purpose for which God had brought them out of Egypt, that he might bring them to himself as a holy nation, bring them into the land. God has called us for a purpose. He's called us to do a work. We must never lose sight of that. Jesus told the 12. He said, "Go you therefore into all the world and preach the gospel to all nations." He said, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness, then shall the end come." He told the 12, go and preach. Go and proclaim the message that I have proclaimed up and down the length and breadth of Judea and Samaria and Galilee. Go to all nations, to all the world, and preach this message. And we find that they went forth to do that. And he told them that was not a one-time thing limited to the first century. He said, all of these who respond and who are baptized, I want you to teach them all the things that I commanded you. One of the things he commanded them was to go into all the world with the message. Israel was called for a job, for a purpose. It was not just simply a selfish purpose. It was, as a light and as an example, they were to be God's model nation. They lost sight of it. Brethren, what are the keys here? What do we find? Paul says these things are written down for our admonition. They're examples, they're types. And they're written down for us, upon whom the ends of the age are come. How can you avoid falling in the wilderness, as so many of God's people through the ages have fallen in the wilderness? You avoid falling in the wilderness by keeping your eyes on God. Keeping your eyes on Christ. Being thankful and appreciative for your calling. Thank God every day for your calling. Thank God for His blessings. Focus in on the wonderful works of God. Remember, call to remembrance these things. Negativism undermines faith. In our conversation with one another, let's build up. Let's encourage. Let's be positive. Ask God to use you as an instrument to build and to encourage one another. Those that feared the eternal and that thought upon His name talked often one with another. The Lord hearkened and heard it. God listened and He was pleased. The Bible tells us the story of those with whom God was not well pleased and they fell in the wilderness. And it also tells the story of those with whom God is well pleased and of whom He says, I will spare him as a father spares his own son that serves him. God is looking. You and I have these lessons and examples set down for us. And brethren, if there's one thing I can leave with you as something that we can think about over and over, let's never lose sight of these examples and the lessons we can learn from it. Let's not be sidetracked by the various things that Satan dangles out there. Let's not be sucked in by the kinds of things that brought down God's people in ancient times. If we keep our eyes set on God and on His promises and on His purpose and on His calling for us, if we never cease to be thankful and appreciative to God, then we will learn to walk with God more and more fully. You see, ultimately it comes down to faith and trust. Developing that trust, that confidence with God, that we walk through life, and yea, though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we will fear no evil. Why? Because we're walking with God. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. There's a confidence that comes from knowing that your hand is in the hand of God. That you're walking with God. And as we keep our focus on the great God who has called us, of whom then shall we be afraid? If God be for us, who can be against us? You know, if God is for us, it really doesn't matter who else is there, does it?